Did you hear that?
No. What?
I have no idea. I think Tommy just said, "I don't want to play with my PP right now." I have no idea
Oh
why I heard
shit.
that.
Oh
Anyways,
my god.
okay. So this is not the Double J podcast. We're
All
gonna
right.
we're gonna go with that for now.
Yes.
So my name is Joshua and this is Joey.
This is Joey
So
talking
first
about
time
movies.
talking about movies. We're not experts, so please don't roast me. But I have some interesting opinions, so I
Yeah,
am excited to talk about that.
we're just two dudes with opinions, wanting to talk about opinions.
So, when's the last time you watched It or Hereditary?
Um, so I watched Hereditary about 3 months ago, I think, and I saw it about a month ago. So pretty recently.
Ooh,
Um, what?
what were you watching it a month ago for? Just
Um,
rewatching it.
I wanted to show my cousins the movie because they'd never seen it before and they're kind of younger, so I like to show them R-rated movies just to be
Oh,
edgy.
nice. You're that one relative that's like, oh shit, let me just
Yeah,
traumatize these kids.
I'm the one cousin that'll just traumatize my other cousins.
Well, what they think about it?
Um, they liked it. I think they liked it. Um, they were certainly a fan of the coming of age element in it and how it affected the rest of the movie. I'm not really sure of their opinions of it though, honestly.
You're just like, here, watch
I
this. All right, I'm gonna yeet out afterwards.
I mean, I think they enjoyed it, but I mean, I don't think it was their favorite movie ever. It was pretty late at night, so I can understand they were just getting sleepy.
I got you. Is there humor kind of like the humor in the show? I mean, in the movie?
Um, I would say so. I think Richie had uh the best the best humor
Yes.
in it, and it just resonated with everyone. I was
Honest.
really surprised with like Finn Wolfhard. He played such a straight man in Stranger Things, and then for him to come and play such a devious asshole, but like just a funny like goofy character was really cool to see.
I know, he was great in it. But honestly, it doesn't get any better. This is the humor that I'm gonna stick with for the rest of my life. Never growing up, never becoming mature.
No, absolutely. That's what we all have to keep. Just a little bit of Richie in us.
Yes. I guess we can start off with talking about what is your favorite part of the movie or scene? I don't know, either one, whichever.
I think my favorite part of the movie was um the coming of age element. Like I liked the idea that it would be the Goonies, but if it would took a twist in horror and I liked kind of the adventurous aspect of it because there's a lot of horror movies that, they have a lot of jump scares and it's just sort of like there's this demon or monster or something and it's just following them. But I felt like the movie was more grounded in like um, just trying to get around when you're growing up and the kind of bond that the kids shared together was more important than the clown itself, even though the clown was so good. Pennywise was incredible, but I felt like it was more frosting on the cake and like I
Mm,
enjoyed the I really enjoyed the scenes with all the kids together. I thought they
yeah.
really handled themselves well.
Honestly, they're so good at acting. I wish I was
Yeah.
that good once.
Yeah. They were really good. If I had any complaints with it though, I wish they gave more to some of the supporting kids. Like
Like Stanley or Mike or something like that.
yeah, Stanley or Mike. I felt like they could have had a little bit more to do, but um other than that, I thought their camaraderie together was really what tied the film together.
No, yeah, definitely. I think that's part of my favorite part of the whole movie itself is just focusing on like what it means to be a kid and a contrast to what it means as to be an adult, especially in the
Mhm.
film. I don't know um, if Stephen King meant it like this or anything like that, but I always felt this
Uh-huh.
kind of almost like cartoonish. You know those like 90s cartoons where like the adults are all like their heads are all like cut off
Yeah.
of this of the all the scenes, and they just kind of like say like gibberish, and it's all about the kids. I had that kind of feeling throughout the whole film as well, except I guess the adults are more like bad
Yeah.
than non-existent, but
I
it's kind of like they set it up as these kids, and some of my favorite scenes are the ones where they isolate the kids more and more into creating a film that's just these kids against the monster. Like there's no one they can turn to, you know?
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting how Pennywise being their greatest fear, a lot of them it was their parents that had to do with like their own fears. Like um what's the kid with the broken arms name? I forgot it.
That was Eddie. Eddie.
Eddie. Yeah, he like his fear was of medicine and like just going outside and like germs and all of that that come came from his mother, and like Stanley um, had a fear of his father being big religious figure in his temple and like
Yeah.
trying to live in his footsteps, and all of those things. I felt like the adults really added to the tone of the movie. Um,
Hmm.
and beyond that, like a more shallow level, they were just really fun and very easy to hate, and it was just fun to hate them, you know?
Yeah. I think one of my favorite scenes was the one where Beverly is in the where she meets the losers club inside
Uh-huh.
the pharmacy or whatever it is,
Yeah.
and she like helps them steal all the medicine by talking to the pharmacy dude. I don't even
Uh-huh.
know what
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah.
That
And
that
she's
that
talking
pharmacy guy, that
yeah.
asshole
Yeah,
pervert guy.
yeah, that, Superman Lois Lane scene,
Yeah.
I was so put off, I was like, "Okay, yeah." I felt like that is one of the turning points where the audience is like, "Okay, well," it becomes believable where they don't turn to, like, the police and they don't turn to, like, adults, and then it just becomes, like, them and their own quest. And I think that's, like, most one of the strongest aspects of the movie, I feel, 'cause I feel like horror movies recently it becomes this like, why don't you do this or why don't you do that? And like,
Uh-huh.
if smart people were inside horror movies, the whole thing wouldn't have happened, you know? And
Yeah.
yeah, and it's not like the kids are making any like super like smart decisions. It's not that kind of horror film where they're like one step ahead of the monster or anything like that. It's more of like you said, like a coming of age film. But to be able to write these scenes in and subtly keep the audience from being like, why don't you just like call the police or something like that? I mean, I think
Yeah.
that's
Oh,
how it was in the book as well, but I haven't read it. So actually, that's a good question. Have you read the book?
I have not read the book. I've been meaning to, but kind of what I like about the movie too is you could you they would make a decision and you might not support that decision, but you could always understand where they were coming from
Yeah.
when they made the certain decision that they did. Even like the bully in the movie that went on like this rampage, you could see like how he was with his father and how he grew up, and you could always understand where every kid was coming from, that they were like a product of their household.
Hmm.
Um, I think one scene in particular that was my favorite, that I felt like really encapsulated the tone of the whole film, was the one where Beverly was in her bathroom and she got trapped into the sink, and then blood just spilled everywhere into the whole
Ooh, yes.
just spilled everywhere into the whole room, and she told the losers club, and I did not think it was gonna happen at all, but they were just like, "Well, someone's gonna have to clean this blood up," and they just kind of had, like, a montage of cleaning up the blood and, like, just having fun together and trying to deal with this shit together, and I just thought it really encapsulated the tone of the rest of the film really well.
Yeah, no, that's and then the father couldn't see it too, so it's like
Yeah.
even more of an isolation. I can't get past saying that my favorite scene might just be like the opening of the film though, like
Oh,
definitive like favorite scene. all everything about the first scene is so good, and I feel like in a writing perspective, getting that first scene to capture the attention of the audience is so difficult, and I feel like it sets things up in such like an emotional and tonal way that the first scene might just be my favorite scene of the movie, but you know.
Yeah, I
Uh-huh.
I actually I agree with you. That opening scene with Georgie and Pennywise in the gutter, it had me on edge the entire time because I was always worried about Pennywise jumping out and they just kept the scene going just a little bit more every time. And I knew it was going to happen eventually, but the way that it happened, and I felt like it made a statement in the opening when you would see Pennywise just chomp this little kid's arm off and just blood just like going everywhere. Um, I thought it was really cool to make that kind of statement at the beginning of the movie. Like, we're not afraid to shy away from um, some blood and some gore, even if it's like children.
Yeah. No, yeah. Honestly, rated R films need to get more credit, honestly, in terms of like money making, because like everything good I feel comes like in a rated R sense. But
Yeah. I mean, I love PG-13, but I think there's something to be said for when you can go take the next step and just go balls to the wall and
hmm. So one of the first things I noticed in the film was in the first scene was the music. The Do you
Mhm.
remember the piano that the mom was playing? That was the underlying soundtrack or the sound for the first scene. And I was
Yeah.
wondering if that was something that carried on throughout for you, or if I don't know,
Hmm.
because I feel like the music is a strong aspect of the film, but there are some things that I noticed about the music in general, like later on, that I want to talk about. But let's see what you think first.
Yeah, I enjoyed the music a lot. I felt like it kind of had that good mix between wonder and fantasy, and also every once in a while it just remind you that it's in a horror movie and it just kind of creak in another direction.
Hmm.
Um, and it had like a little bit of cheese to it too. Like I could feel the 80s in the score. You could like feel the nostalgia um dripping through the fucking music score, and it was nice. Um, I haven't really analyzed it much beyond that. What are your thoughts on it?
Honestly, it's kind of the same as what you're saying. I feel like there's a lot of good in the soundtrack, especially during very emotional high points. Like for example, the one where they jump into the I guess lake is what it's called,
Uh-huh.
and they have like their little montage playing around in the waters. The same with the cleaning, um, and even the very start where they're just in the school, and it's kind of like that vibe. And also in the horror scenes, I feel like the soundtrack was really good in like accentuating that. From what you were saying though, you said there's like a little bit of a cheesy aspect to it, which I
Mhm.
also appreciate most of the time. But this is one of the aspects where noticed after watching the film a couple times is there are a couple small moments in the film where I feel like the that kind of nostalgic writing and sound, both like in dialogue and in music, can go a little bit overboard, at least for my tastes. And
Yeah,
that's what I was gonna say.
I agree with that because nostalgia is really what's in right now, and people are always banking on what happened like 10 or 20 years ago at this point, or 30 years ago, I guess, with this movie. And there was like scenes where, you know, you'd go into that the one kid's room, and he'd open up his room and there'd be all these 80s posters in it, and it was just like constantly reminding you like it was the 80s. Um
Yeah.
I like the kind of subtle story directions they went with the movie, like to give nostalgia, but I felt like some things were over the top at some points.
Yeah, that was one of the things I noticed. But I mean, there's it was just slightly reliant in some moments, so that's not like the most horrible thing to do. I like I do like the nostalgia train that is on, it's always nice to
Uh-huh.
remember these kinds of well, I mean, I'm saying remember, but like, well, since when was I alive in the 80s? But
Yeah,
but you hear things and it's almost like a simpler time, I guess, or at least in our imaginations.
yeah.
And I always like that kind of thing, but just sometimes where you want to have it like add to the film and not really like rely on it. And in some moments, I felt like it was a little bit more of a foundation of nostalgia in the scene or in the story than it was like an addition.
Yeah, I could feel it sometimes as a bit of a hindrance. I mean, it's just a small nitpick, honestly, but
Yeah.
um, I really enjoy this film, so that's all I can really do in terms of negatives, is just
I'm,
do a little nitpicks.
yeah, I'm trying to think of like a specific scene. I should have noted this down, but I'll try and think of one just not to just throw out opinions and stuff like that. But
Uh-huh.
let's talk about the acting because I think that's like my favorite part of the film in terms of like a technical aspect.
Yeah, I really love the acting of the kids, but I felt like they were almost overshadowed by how brutally amazing Bill Skarsgård was
I
in the
know.
movie. He was incredible, and it was funny because originally the film was supposed to have Will Poulter in the role of Pennywise,
Yeah.
and it was supposed to have, I think, um, Fukunawa directing it, the guy who did True Detective.
Oh, really?
And
I didn't know about that.
yeah, and they had creative differences with the studio, so he dropped out, and then Will Poulter dropped out because his director wasn't doing it anymore. And I was really sad about it when I heard the news because I loved the actor, and I thought whatever came after him would be a bit of a step down for the role of Pennywise, but I felt like Bill Skarsgård came in and he just tore that role to shreds. Like he had everything down from like the goofiness to the intimidation to just the way he spoke, and all of his inflections just gave you so much about the character.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite parts of his acting as well was like um almost how he like distorts and like makes such a large inflections in his voice. I felt like the same in his like movements. I felt like his movements was part of I would I would almost say like my favorite part of his acting, especially in that scene where Mike I'm not sure how much is like CGI, how much is like a stunt double or whatever, but
Yeah.
but in the scene where Mike when were first like seeing Pennywise scare Mike with outside like the meat shop or whatever, and
Uh-huh.
all the hands are, and then the door opens up and you see Pennywise like hanging, and then there's just
Yeah.
like two yellow eyes, and he just like moves super weirdly.
Yeah, I felt like even more so, I felt like Bill Skarsgård was in tune with the director and what the film was going to be because I felt like if he went a little bit more goofy or a little bit more serious, it wouldn't have worked for the movie. But it gave like the perfect tone because the way he played the performance, it was a little cheesy because you're playing a clown and you can't be too subtle when you're
Mm-hmm.
doing it. But he was never like too over the top and he was never too serious. And when he did get serious, it really made an impact for what the story was trying to say because the film isn't really that dark of a movie. It kind of had a lighthearted finish and ending, and I felt like his performance really reflected that.
Yeah, I feel like that is what I feel like a lot of people on the other side had to say was the heart and soul aspect of like the kids and stuff like that might have been something that I don't know, people didn't want to see in the film. Uh, I feel like mainly because I haven't read the book, and so anytime there's like an adaptation of a book and people love that book, they go into a film expecting something, and I feel like that is a lot of downfall, especially even if you're not if it's not a book or anything like that, going into films, like, having an expectation of something is always very dangerous, and I know it's, like, unavoidable sometimes, but, I felt like a lot of what people had to say that were in, in critique of this film were
Mhm.
more because I wouldn't wanna say because they had some kind of, like, expectation going into the film, and since I'd never read the book, I didn't have well, I knew, like, the general storyline or, like, the general, um, it is so, like, famous, of course, you know something
Yeah.
about it, um, but I didn't have any expectations, and so that kind of horror movie that's more focused on, like, coming of age and heart um, and just, like, 80s kids, I
Mhm.
didn't mind that at all. I
Yeah.
actually thought it added to the film a lot.
I I agree with you actually. There's a lot of people that um say that all the time that the book is always better and you should always read the book before watching a movie. But I actually kind of feel like people should be doing the opposite. I know it's a minority opinion, but when you read the book before you watch a movie, um, you really have an idea of what you want the movie to be. So you already have an expectation at the door of what you want to do. And I know it's important to stay um, faithful to the material, but you don't want a movie to just be directing, to be directly at adapting what's going on, or else why even have the movie itself, honestly?
Mhm,
Um, so I feel like if you watch the movie first, you can still fill the book with like your imagination and what's going on in your head um, a little bit better. Because if you read a book, you have the expectation of the door, and I feel like the downfall of a lot of movies is when people have certain expectation for a movie, what they're looking for, or what they want, and then when a movie gives them something different, they can often not enjoy it as much.
mhm. Yeah, that's why I feel a lot of people forget in terms of these like new adaptation kind of wave. I guess it's always kind of been like that. Movies are generally not um like wholly original, or like when they are, it's pretty rare if I have to say. Like usually
Uh
it's
huh.
like an adaptation or inspired by these true events or inspired by that or this. Maybe not like a direct adaptation of a book or anything like that, but it always has like some kind of um element of another medium, um and generally not original screenplays, which I feel like most people forget the importance of telling a story in terms of what medium you're trying to tell that story in. And
Hmm.
there's some, well, we can get into that later, but there's some aspects of film that they're limitations almost. Not that you can't like push boundaries here and there, but I feel like most people forget that it is a movie and a book is different from a movie. There's a lot more time and um, not even just like chronological time in a book that you have to like tell certain aspects of the story, but also like you can tell like you can write like 10 pages on like a single second, whereas like in a film generally you can slow down time or speed it up here and there, but a second is going to be a second. So there's some limitations that film has that are really fun to work around, but at the same time I feel like most people forget that it is a different medium, and so those kinds of expectations you have, or those kinds of things that the book satisfies or other mediums satisfy is sometimes different, and that's why I like adaptations and how adaptations are adapted and not completely the same, because a film is different from a comic book or a book or a t or even a TV show, so
Uh-huh.
um what films lack that books have, there's also things that books lack that film can accentuate even more.
Yeah, I really enjoy that too. Like when I was saying before about like some of the kids didn't get as much screen time as I'd hoped, but we were talking off air, like the film was already a little bit long itself. Like it was
Mhm.
starting to drag a little bit near the ending. So as a filmmaker, you have to make those hard choices to say like, hey, what is this going to do for the pacing of my film? Whereas when you're writing a book, like I think is like 800 or 900 pages long. And I know this is just half of the book, it was the kids, but still, that's 400 pages of material that you have to turn into a 2-hour movie, which
Mhm.
can be difficult sometimes. So I think, given the constraints that they had, um, the pacing worked out really well for the movie.
So I think this is a good time to ask, if you had to choose like two technical aspects of the film that you found stood out the most or um were the most skillly executed, what would you say, or do you have any opinion on that?
Yeah, I would say for me, um, I think certainly the acting was my favorite part of the movie.
Mhm.
Um, I thought the actors really shined well.
Definitely, yeah.
Um, I would actually go with the direction, I think, because I think the film did a really good job of keeping its tone secure and keeping faithful to the book while also um, adding its new flair. Um, and it never really like it had a couple pacing problems, but given the amount of source material, I felt like it was paced really well, with that in mind. Um,
Yeah.
and yeah,
Yeah, go ahead.
no, no, that's it. That's
No,
it.
I was just gonna say I agree a lot. I think the directing is really skillful, and in terms of different ways than most people expect. People have these. Some directors have these like really obvious flares and stuff like that. Um,
Mhm.
I haven't seen enough of Andy
Muschietti.
Muschietti
Yeah.
stuff, so I'm not exactly sure. Oh my gosh, I'm not exactly sure if there were any of his flares in there, but what I liked the most was this kind of almost silent observer, subtle directing that went with it. For example, they had a lot of like winding aerial shots,
Uh-huh.
and during like the most highest points of the film, like the swimming part again, there it was a lot of aerial shots during those times, whereas there is more like of a tight shots when the kids are all together fighting against Pennywise. There's
Uh-huh.
also a bunch of winding shots, and I felt like that was it added a lot in terms of it and the kind of tone you want. For example, when the title card appears, um, and it's just like it's flying through like the the
Yeah, the
tunnels,
sewer.
yeah, the sewers and stuff like that, and it like kind of turns, and then the title card it shows up, kind of that, like except in other areas of the film as well. I feel like that added a lot, and certain like there isn't a lot of like very cinematography, like very high cinematography type stuff, but when there
Mhm.
is, I felt like it was very what is the word correct for that scene. For example, um, when Stanley is inside that room near the beginning where he's supposed to go through his studies or whatever, his dad sends him into that room,
Uh-huh.
and he's trying not to look at the painting, but then he looks at it and it's like tilted, and so he corrects it, and that shot is from the perspective of the painting, so you're like a little bit tilted, and then he like moves you, and those kinds of like small things I felt added a lot to the tone of the scenes without being like overbearing, you know.
Yeah, I agree with that because the cinematography, it was um subtle for most of the movie, and every once in a while it'd do something a little bit just to remind you that um you're in this environment. It really had like an observational kind of camera work. Like it felt like you were watching the movie in like third person omniscient
Hmm.
until you were in with the kids themselves and they wanted to make you feel like you were part of their losers club.
Hmm.
Um
Yeah.
like it felt like it was kind of like textbook, like almost like you could see which camera angles they were about to do, but they were the right choices to
Hmm.
go with it for those particular scenes. Like they weren't trying to go for something super flashy for the scene because they were just trying to rely on like the performances and the story itself. So I really liked it.
Hmm. Yeah, so that takes it into what my two are. Of course, number one is acting. You cannot talk about the acting enough. Like,
Oh my god.
I didn't feel like anybody was like out, like that stuck out like in anywhere of the film, and I watched it like really closely multiple times, you know? I'm like,
Yeah.
any of these side characters? Like sometimes I'd be like Stanley, but not in an acting sense. I feel like his writing is just I don't know whether it just fit him really well because he's like always kind of doesn't have much to say and is kind of cowardly if that's like part of his character or if it was just like, he they didn't give him enough time to grow as a character. But that has nothing to do with acting, you know?
Yeah.
So I literally can't find any any instances of bad acting in the film.
Yeah, for sure.
But that brings me to this my second favorite part of favorite aspect technically of the film. At first, I was gonna go with writing, but
Mhm.
I couldn't put um put my full like love into the writing
Uh-huh.
as much just because I haven't read the book. Because
Yeah.
I didn't know how much was the screenwriter, and I bet it is a lot because I would assume that the kind of dialogue that fits so well in this film, when Richie like goes off like here and there, like your mom and stuff like that. I doubt
Yeah.
that's in the book. So I want to say heavily the screenwriting was really well done, but I couldn't talk about it as much because, I don't know what was Stephen King and what exactly was the screenwriter. But, it was condensing a 400 page half of a book into a 2-hour film. And so that in and of itself deserves some kind of praise.
Uh-huh.
But in terms of deciding like what my second was, I think I eventually went with blocking, which is
Uh-huh.
a little bit weird, but having that many characters in the film and even scenes where there aren't a lot of characters in the film, I always felt like whatever was being focused on wasn't always the only thing that was happening. And I feel like I mean, blocking might be part of directing. I'm not exactly sure who like makes all the decisions about setting up people and placing them. It might even be some
Yeah.
actors decide to stand here, instead of there. But it might be. I'm just saying it might be a little bit of the director too. But
Uh-huh.
blocking was what stood out to me. Like always whatever's focused on there's not all the information is centered there, and I feel like most films or even like early people who want to start out with films, they kind of like don't really think about the background, like
Mhm.
in terms of setting. Sure, like this is set in a school, the background is a school, but I feel like whatever the camera's focused on isn't exactly the only source of information that you can display. The background helps a lot in tone as well. I know it's kind of an obvious scene, but the one where Ben is inside the library and he's like flipping through the pages about the explosion that killed a bunch of kids, the dairy explosion or whatever.
Uh-huh.
And
Yeah.
then you can see like Pennywise take over like one of the maybe adults or teachers, or I'm not sure exactly. and she just like stares at him from behind as he like
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
that kind of thing throughout.
I really enjoyed the blocking too because the film was always trying to give you a like a gentle push at what they wanted you to look at, but they were always doing little things behind the scenes. And I feel like a lot of it comes from like the original Halloween movie from 78, I think, that started doing that. And you know how like they had Michael Myers in the background of almost every scene, like, watching the people
Mhm,
all the time, but they would never focus on him. I
mhm,
feel like they did something similar to that in this movie where, you were always feeling a little bit on edge, and there was always something going on in the background that just wasn't quite right, and whether it was, like, the adults being weird in that town
uh-huh,
um, or, like, something shifting in the background, like an item or something,
mhm,
I felt like it was always giving your eyes something to do, but it was never too much where um, you lost focus of where the story was going, you know?
mhm. Yeah, definitely. Um, yeah, it adds a lot to the tone, especially I really like the tone throughout the film, but there are some moments where it kind of jumps a little bit quickly.
Mhm.
There are moments that are like a lot of emotional 80s kids high, and then it would go to like a scare or like a tenser tone with Pennywise. And generally that worked out well, which is good on the writing and good on the directing. But there are some moments where it kind of jumps back and forth really quickly. And
Yeah.
so adding these kind of like background movements and stuff like that during the kind of scenes where you weren't exactly tense yet, like the one with Ben in the library, it's just
Mhm.
before it starts to get tense. And so it adds this kind of slower build instead of like making it choppy from like um I'm a kid in the library to Pennywise is gonna like run at me. It adds this kind of slower transition by having this not quote unquote like tense part of the film because you're not even focused on that background where the teachers or the librarian or whatever is staring at him, but it's like in the
Mhm.
back of your mind it starts to make you a little bit uneasy, and so it leads into the other scene really nicely.
Yeah, especially with, like, that scene that you're talking about specifically, that's a thing I didn't even notice until, like, the 3rd time I ended up watching the
Hmm.
movie, was, like it was just one thing that, like, really made my stomach drop and something that a lot of people I don't think noticed when they first ended up watching it, and I think there's a couple different things like that that give it some good rewatch value too.
Yeah, and that's my favorite part is like subtlety and rewatchability because
Yeah, I thought it was, um really cool because it shows, like, how passionate the director and actors and everybody was on set, like, they'd even do these little things just because they know, "Hey, in a for a couple after a couple watches, people will probably start picking up on this or this," and they're just always discussing their characters, you can just feel it when the movie's going on.
Yeah, and even farther than that, I was talking blocking mostly in terms of like tone and the tenser scenes, but I felt myself noticing during like the happy scenes or the emotional high scenes as well, m- less so a directing aspect, but more of an actor aspect. There's always something going on in the background that like adds to the foreground of the film, even in those happier scenes. For I guess it wasn't necessarily a happy scene, but for example, the one where uh, Bill flips over a poster during a parade and talks about how um, that girl, I forgot her name, but the girl that went missing, they just put another poster of another kid that went
Uh-huh.
missing um, right on top of them as if like, moving on to the next kid, like it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
And then in the background, you see Richie or Finn. He's just like pulling, like just fighting the guy with the trumpet, or I'm not
Yeah!
100% sure what instrument it
Oh,
was.
man.
And
I
I
love
just
that
like died. Yeah, I was
That's so funny. Honestly, I think watching that movie and just watching Richie, like, no
like
matter what is going on, you could just watch Richie, and you could have a totally different kind of enjoyment of the entire movie. I think it's really fun. I honestly think Finn Wolfhard gave the uh, well,
Second, second.
I don't know though because um I forgot the actor's name who plays the main kid, but he was incredible too.
Yeah,
But
Jaden.
yeah, I think that Richie really was a scene stealer, and I just loved watching him so much and what he was doing in the background. Like they were always aware of their characters.
Mhm. But yeah, so not only in the tense scene, sometimes in the non-tense scenes as well, it added a lot, and so that's why it became my second favorite thing about the film. Technically, is that blocking.
Yeah. You want to maybe move on to Hereditary?
Oh yeah, yeah, sure.
I don't know. I just want to talk about Hereditary so bad.
Yes,
I
I
I
can
really
understand that.
enjoy the It movie, but Hereditary is a movie that I think is going to be studied in film classes for a long time afterward. And I
I'd
feel like
hope so. Yes.
it's a film that has changed the way that horror is because it really wasn't like anything else in horror that had come out when it came out. I mean, it's a slow burn of a movie. It's incredibly dark. It wasn't like what was going on at the time because when that was coming out, there was like um, it was really big, and Get Out, like the horror movies with more of a lighter tone to them were really big at the moment. And then Hereditary comes out, and it just does so much for the genre, and I just love it so much.
I know it's actually my favorite horror film of all time, but
Oh,
that's a
really?
little bit premature, I guess. But I've seen a little bit of everything in terms of the horror genre, and I felt like it encapsulated everything that I look for in a horror film. So that's why like that kind of best horror film for me is very objective because I feel like horror is very objective in general, It's what
You mean
people
like
are.
subjective?
Oh, yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah, I don't know why I said objective. Yeah, subjective. Yeah, yeah, horror is very subjective in general, and so some people look for this and some people look for that, and that's why I'm not super ashamed of saying Hereditary is my favorite, just because, um, there are certain things I really like in horror, and I feel like it hit, like, all of the boxes.
Yeah, oh my god, I love this movie. It really hit different to me because I thought it was interesting that when it came out, audiences didn't really like it that much. Like it wasn't what people were expecting when they were walking into the movie. Which I can understand, when you're looking for a horror movie, kind of the beaten path right now is um just the fun kind of jump scare, a little more shallow horror film,
Mm,
but I thought that Hereditary did such a good job of um incorporating the horror with the story that they were doing, and the horror had a deeper meaning and more of a connection to what the characters were going through themselves, and how their life was a horror movie beyond the supernatural elements that were going on.
yeah, that was part of, um like my own like preference in terms of horror is to focus on um the everyday horror first and then add the supernatural or um the really like extreme parts later. When
Mhm.
you listen to Ari Aster talk about the making of the film, he always just talks about how it's just about this family that goes through trauma.
Uh-huh.
And I feel like that is the most powerful part of why the film is so impactful, at least to me, is because it's almost like everything else fits in a puzzle piece really nicely, but the main point is just watching these people deal with or their inability to deal with these kinds of traumatic things that happen sometimes to people like right now. And
Mhm.
it's a little bit harder to run away from. It's something more that you think about when you're like, in bed alone. Whereas like it would have like, okay, it's a clown and I enjoy the movie and stuff like that, but it's a monster and that's not really something that is gonna haunt me at night or just
Uh-huh.
me personally, so of course it'll like
Yeah.
be bad for some other people. But in terms of like dealing with trauma and death and how a family tries to reconcile, but they're unable to, that's a lot more personal.
Yeah, one of the things that I heard from the movie that I thought was incredibly interesting, which I don't know if I heard it from you or online somewhere, but when Ari Aster started writing the movie, it wasn't actually a horror film. But when he came in tune with, like, the kind of trauma that the family was going through, it kind of just escalated into something of that extent. And, like, Pygon the demon and the supernatural element wasn't really the main focal point of the movie the whole time in the writing process. And I thought that really says something about what the movie was trying to say about how, like, death and trauma can isolate you and your family, and how your relationships with with your family can change based on the experiences that you have with each other. Um, I thought it was very palpable in that moment. And if we're talking about like specific scenes from this movie, everybody knows there's one scene that is just it's different than all the other scenes when
I
um
knew exactly what you were talking about instantly.
yeah, I mean, it's just when because beyond that, it beyond, like, the guy's little sister, um, dying in the way that she died, which was so horribly gruesome and so unexpected in the story because were watching the movie and you felt like, "Okay, I know where the story is probably gonna go. This is probably gonna have, like, an Exorcist type vibe where this girl is going to be, like, the protagonist for, like, this demon." Um,
Mhm.
and the way that they just killed her off like that was not only, like, narratively something interesting and something you don't see coming, but it changes, like, the tone of the movie and what it is supposed to it just changes, like, what you think the film is trying to say all in that one scene, and the acting from, um man, I forgot his name. Is it, like,
Oh,
Alex Wolff, maybe? No,
it's
I don't know.
yeah, it is. It's
It
Alex
is?
Wolf.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, okay, good. Um, I thought he was so incredible in that movie because when that happens, you just have no idea. You're immediately empathizing with him because you're like, man, what would I do if I was in the middle of nowhere and something like that happened to me? And the way he just drives home and he just parks the car and he just doesn't even say anything and he just goes to
Ugh.
bed. It was so devastating. And I loved the way that the film so took its time for you to mentally understand his mindset of what he's feeling in that particular scene, I just thought was excruciating and terrifying, honestly. It was the most terrifying scene I've I've ever seen in a horror movie, I think, in my entire life.
Honestly, that film was so I mean, that scene was so emotional, like and I think that's one of my favorite things about, the trends recently of very experimental films, I guess, is this kind of like big brain aspect of these trailers that they release. That's my favorite because we were talking about expectations earlier, and I can understand that there's sometimes this inability to come into a movie without any sort of expectation, like you try your best, but the trailers are there to get you into the movie. Like the first
Mhm.
time I've never heard of Arya, so this is his directorial debut, I'm pretty
It's
sure?
so crazy. I cannot
I
believe you
know.
did this kind of film on your directorial debut. That's
So,
unbelievable.
yeah, so I had no idea about this film, I had no idea who Ari Aster is, and what when I first watched that trailer, I was like, "This is gonna be one of, like, the greatest horror films, like, that's come out in the last, like, I was about to say century, I meant decade. A decade. Yeah, and so in that trailer, it was it set it up so that she was gonna be some kind of, like, or, like, the focus was gonna be on, um, her, Charlie, and how, perhaps she's gonna get taken over by this demon that is part of the film. And so that makes that scene so much more in fact impactful. They just like trick you in the trailer, and I'm like so happy that they did that.
Oh, yeah.
And I feel like that's like a trend that's going on in more recent trailers where they kind of like lead you to expect this thing's gonna happen, and then that allows them to not only do something that's unexpected, but also to surprise whoever is watching. And sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad, but I feel like right here it was one of the best aspects of um, of the trailer versus the film, and especially the fact that I feel like for me, it's super easy. I have, like, one expectation, and then as soon as that's, like, shattered or I start to watch the film, I start to, like, drop all other expectations, and I kind of just engross myself in the film. And I
Mhm.
felt like in that scene right there, it's like, well, I don't know what's gonna happen for the rest of the film now. I mean, I was expecting Charlie to be like a pivotal, I mean, she is a pivotal, like, emotional character, but like a pivotal, like, alive character, I guess.
Yeah.
Um, and so after that was shattered, it was just like, well, I'm just along for the ride with this family. And I think that was like, ooh, that turning point in that film is.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of Charlie, I don't think this film works nearly as well if that little girl doesn't give such an incredible performance and such a terrifying performance for you to believe so wholeheartedly that she can carry this movie and that this movie is all about her. And
Mhm.
then for her to just like leave the film instantly. And she was so good that her presence, I felt, was just felt throughout the rest of
Yeah.
the movie. Even though that's a product of the directing and the acting, I thought her performance loomed so large that, um, while the rest of the movie was going on, I could feel like she was a part of it, throughout the rest of the movie.
Yeah, even in the scenes that she was in, as few as they were in the beginning, it's her acting was so empathetic, but, like, off-putting at the same time. Like, I was like, "Oh, like, Charlie's just trying to eat some cake, and now she's, like, dying," but at the same time, I'm like, "Stop clicking your tongue, you."
Oh, dude, there was
Like,
one
"Why'd you
time.
chop the head off that
Oh,
pigeon? God damn it."
yeah, she, like, took scissors and she just snipped the head off of a bird, and I was just like, "Ugh." Um, there was a time where, I think a friend of mine was just kind of clicking his tongue in a room, and I literally, like, froze and I, like, had, like, a spasm because he just went like, and I could not handle that shit at all. So
Oh god.
scary because it was so reminiscent of, like, their emotions because like, they were so because like, um, Alex Wolff's character was so scared of his sister and, like, what he'd done to her, and for her to, like, come back like that, and, um, you could just so empathize with, like, his feeling of, like, "Well, if she's coming back, then she almost certainly hates me because I made such a terrible, terrible mistake in my life that I don't know if I'm ever going to come back from." And
Mhm.
he doesn't apparently at the end at all.
But yeah, that brings me to if I had to like choose my two technical aspects again.
Mhm.
Honestly, I love acting so much. I don't know. I want to say it and Hereditary here are just like, the actings are just stellar, but honestly,
Yeah.
sometimes I'm like maybe I just really love acting. But that would be my second is acting. But first, of course, has to be directing slash cinematography.
Oh
For me.
man. Just some of the things they did with scares too, it was always different because like their horror was mostly disturbing in the movie, but when n- mostly near the end of the movie that they were um going with like someone was being chased or there was like um more conventional scares, they were found ways with the camera work to displayed in a way that I'd never seen before, and that unknown factor really, like, scared me. Like, when, that one scene where it was just a close up, or not a close up, but it was more of a uh, medium wide shot of
Mhm.
Alex Wolff's character, and then you could just see the roof, but you couldn't tell that there was someone on the roof until, like, about 2 or 3 seconds into the frame,
Mhm.
and the idea that you see that, but you're under the knowledge that you didn't immediately catch that, and that, like, you could be dead immediately, and it just brings my fear and anxiety up to 11.
And that's why there's another thing about what I like about this film is the tone throughout. I mean, I attribute that to the cinematography and the directing. But that's the scene in the trailer and also the first scene in the movie that just sets up the whole thing. Kind of like it does, except it is more like back and forth between tense and happy and sometimes the mastery in that transition. Whereas like Hereditary is one tone and
Yeah.
it sticks to it so well, like throughout the whole film. Like that first scene where it just pulls into this like this miniature house, and then as soon as it hits the room, that like the dad walks in and you're like, what the hell? That's
Oh, man.
that transition. I literally watched this movie so much and I try to find where they cut the miniature into the house, or perhaps like what kind of things did they employ to like transition these scenes. Obviously, they didn't like build this giant house, cut it in half, and then like pull it in from like super far away. Obviously, not. There's some kind of like quote unquote movie magic there,
Yeah.
and I'm like trying to find where it was or what it is they did, and I literally cannot find it. It's so smooth and so disturbing at the same time.
It's the cinematography in this movie, I think, is one of my 2 favorite things. I love the direction, but the cinematography specifically, um, really, I feel like is nothing short of genius at work
Mhm.
because there's so many angles and like that opening scene you're talking about really just sets the tone for everything that you're about to see in this movie because like you'd never see anything like that before, and for it to start with such a creative direction when it comes to the camera work. But at the same time, it wasn't anything that was like overly flashy. Like the cinematography moves so slow and it's so still. Like it's not afraid to show you the entirety of the scene that's going on. And so you have so much to like try to comprehend at one time in a certain scene that you can't help but feel on edge the whole time because you know something's always going on in the background. Like I know we were talking about how they do that in It, but I feel like in Hereditary they amp that up to 11.
Mhm.
Like there's always something going on, and it's almost like directly like it's downright frightening all the time. Like it never gives you a break.
And, I feel like they do a lot of this kind of subverting your expectations in this film, which is why I love it so much. I love once you watch like a bunch of movies, and I'm not like old enough to have seen like an insane amount of movies, but you know, I've watched more than your general um college student, I guess. Um, but there's certain things where you almost expect to happen or expect to be this done this way or that way. um for example, when you were talking earlier about it focusing on Alex Wolf and after the Charlie gets hit by the pole, and in a couple scenes, or even the direct scene afterwards. I can't remember if it was a couple or a direct scene afterwards, but he lays in bed and it just stares at him while you hear
Oh,
the mom go outside and be like, "Hey, I'm going shopping. Like, let me know if you need anything or whatever." And then she goes out and then she just starts screaming. And I feel like generally as a horror, you want to like focus on that, like that huge outburst of emotion. Like you want that to like burst off of the screen in terms of like writing horror or like watching horror. But in this certain scene, it stares at him and her screams is in the background. And so it focuses on these kinds of inner emotions instead of these outward emotions. And there are scenes where it focuses on the outward emotions as well. And so you don't really know what's going to happen or what we're going to be focusing on in any one scene. You know, it could be Alex and how he's just so traumatized, or it could be focusing on Tony Collette, who's just like screaming
oh,
um her like soul out. And um
yeah. I it was always subverting expectations, which is something I really love when I want to go into a movie. Like you said, when you see a lot of films, it's almost like you're craving for something to change or bend what you're looking for. Like
mhm,
I love getting my expectations subverted and to see what kind of roller coaster a filmmaker's gonna take me through. And it's almost especially interesting when a filmmaker can subvert your expectations, but for you to understand, like, this was the best way that this
yeah,
story could have gone. Like,
mhm,
it's never like subverting your expectations. Like, I have this problem with Shyamalan a couple times where he's always trying to subvert your expectations, but
mhm,
a lot of times it doesn't really fit right
mhm,
for what the story is going for, and it just takes a left turn that you're not um, that you don't feel like fits with the rest of the narrative.
mhm,
With this film, it would take turns like that, but it would always make the story increasingly more interesting, and
uh-huh.
it would add much more layer to the story while also surprising you at the same time.
Yeah, and that's what it focuses on sometimes, and what it focuses on other times is just i- it's perfect almost, you know? It's like that one moment where it focuses on Alex instead of the mom, and you can hear her screaming. And then on the other hand, it the one where the Tony asks Alex to take Charlie to the party, and
Mhm.
they're driving, and then they drive past the pole, and it just like abruptly like freezes, like after the pole is right in the middle of frame. Like you stop
Uh-huh.
following the car and it just freezes on this pole, and there's just that symbol on there. You're like, okay, well, I like it's almost goes over your head at that moment. Um,
Yeah.
but it becomes so important and so nice to see when you rewatch the movie and you see um this kind of almost, I wouldn't say throwaways, like, but it's just so small. It just freezes there and so abruptly for just like maybe a second or a fraction of a second, and then moves on to the next scene, and you're like, okay. And then it becomes so important later on. It's like,
Yeah, it's another one of those things that I love about the pacing of the movie specifically because it has like a slow pace and it's taking its time, but I never felt bored throughout the movie. It
mhm,
it always with the camera work, it was always so slow, and whenever it would freeze on something, I was almost never sure if it meant something or if it didn't mean something. So when I was watching it for the first time and it would freeze on that pole, I was like, it's just like a cool shot because it really is a cool shot. Like the symmetry of like the pole being in the middle of the shot and seeing the car go by. It's just like interesting from like a visual point of view. But then when you come back and he's driving on the way back and you see what happens, like it's always giving you something that you can't really quite comprehend until you go back and you see it another time.
Honestly, that's all. I looked up his name is Powell Pogorzelski. I
I'm
probably
not sure,
I probably
honestly.
butchered that really badly, but that was a cinematographer, and he also worked on Midsommar. I
Oh
always say
man.
Midsommar for some reason. I think it's just a meme now, but
Yeah,
he
it's
worked on Midsummer as well, and shout out to him, Jesus.
yeah, he's really fucking good.
But
Yeah.
yeah,
I would say for me, yeah, the two things that really stuck out with me were the cinematography and the acting, probably because I we haven't really talked about Tony Collette's performance a lot yet, and I genuinely felt like at the time, um, that was the best performance of the entire year, and I still hold on that.
yeah, and
It
she didn't
might
even get
She
nominated.
didn't even get nominated. That was so stupid, but um it was a kind of a transcending performance. It's a performance that I think about a lot, honestly. Um, the way that you could see her like breaking down at like the dinner table when she was with the father and the son. Um, and they were
Ooh,
just trying to have that conversation about um getting over Charlie and uh what that meant. And you could see like the resentment in her eyes and the anger, but you could also see like the sadness that was behind it. And you could see everything while she was performing, but it was always so encapsulating.
yeah, honestly, that is my if I had to choose one like scene that's like my favorite scene in the whole movie, that was it. But there's also a lot of horror stuff that later comes on that I also really love. But in terms of a story aspect, that scene is literally the theme of the movie in one scene. And I felt like that was so well written in when she talks about how this could have brought the family together. Like we could have
Oh,
there's this trauma that happened, and there's bad things that happen in everyone's lives and every family's lives, and but they could have used this to grow closer and be more vulnerable to each other, and instead it just tore them even more apart. um and her performance is so it brings out the frustration, the flaws in the character, but it also brings out that relatability and that empathy, and I feel like that's one of the most, um the strongest things, like, an actor can do is no matter what kind of character it is, if it's, like, the villain, the most diabolical, hated, like, antagonist, or the most straight arrow, protagonist, is to add that little bit of empathy, because I feel like in those, extremes and even in everything in between, there's this sort of, this is a character, and it's not necessarily a bad thing to do acting as like a character, let's say like Superman, acting like super um, straight arrow and stuff like that, but
uh-huh.
adding this whole type of human empathy quality, you can do that in anywhere from Superman to the most like evil uh character from Schindler's List comes to mind as the first
Oh
one.
yeah.
The antagonist there, but adding that kind of you can add that kind of empathy throughout any of these really good, really bad characters and anywhere in between. Um, and in that moment, she is she's not a perfect character, by any stretch of the word. She can't deal with this trauma in her life, but she delivers it in a such a human way. Like in terms of writing,
Yeah.
it is her fault. Like, I'm not saying it's like Alex is has no fault, or what his name in Peter in the film.
Oh yeah,
He has no
Peter.
fault. He has fault too, but it is simultaneously purely uh Annie's fault, which is Tony Collette's character,
Uh-huh.
and purely Peter's fault. and for her to deliver that in for her to almost blame him, um, in such an empathetic and relatable way, um, made the scene and honestly the whole movie fit together. That was like the cinematography is almost cinematography, directing slash writing, etc. That kind of like made the film, like, but
Yeah.
the acting fit it together into place.
Yeah, I actually, speaking of that scene, I thought the cinematography, that's another thing I loved about the cinematography because I'm not entirely certain, but I feel like um, during that scene throughout, um, it was only one camera shot or one or two shots, and it was just showing like, or yeah, one or two shots that was just um, showing off the performances and the way that they were speaking, and I felt like it took a back seat. And so
Mhm.
it really like it showed like maturity from a cinematography point of view to really take a step back and let the actors really take control of the scene at a particular point. Like it
Yeah.
knew when to bend the camera work and when to keep it simple so that you could focus on what the story needed you to focus on.
Yeah, that kind of trade-off is super nice. Like that one scene where she's walking towards uh, what's her character's name? Jones' apartment again,
Oh
and it
yeah.
like it's like an overhead, and it kind of like it shows her, and then it switches to overhead, and then it switches to like upside down, like those kinds of scene where it's like she's walking, the cinematography takes over, and then where it's these scenes of like emotional outbursts and beautiful dialogue or monologue, and it hands it over to the actors, and the kind of perfect um teamwork that the film is allows everything to shine, honestly.
Yeah, it felt like a really good team collaboration because there was always time for something else to shine in the movie that didn't quite um, get something in like the scene before. Like you were always noticing something different that was highlighted in every part of the movie. And I really enjoyed that part because from a sensory point of view, you were thinking visually or um, from your ears, you were listening to something different um, or well, I guess just those 2 really, but from a different from, like, camera work versus acting versus, like, the musical score, it all just blended together so well, um, I
Honestly,
yeah.
on that note, it's I'm almost like a really this is gonna sound super like sociopathic or something like that, but I honestly listen to that soundtrack like just for fun. Like I
Yeah,
listen to the um the uh the ending scene where he gets taken over completely, um and there's this sort of triumphant march of a score. It's called Reborn by Colin Stetson.
uh-huh.
Oh, it's so good. Oh, like I was watching I was listening to it and reading some comments about it. And there's this one person that said it's it was uh the musical equivalent of this King's March almost. In a
Uh-huh.
demon perspective. Like, at
Yeah.
first, it starts off with literally, I can imagine the story when I'm listening to that song. It's literally first, it's all these minor demons just being celebratory and expecting this arrival of Payman. And then when this deep glottal I don't really know exactly what the instrument is used, but it just enters in and it's almost like the gates have opened and Payman's there. And then it's just builds and builds until like the very end where it's just everyone's just going like super berserk over this demon's like triumph.
Yeah.
And oh geez, I just listened to that like in my car alone at
Yeah.
night just for
Yeah,
fun.
no, that's, like, the kind of scary thing with the scores like that, and almost like the ending of the movie, is, like, it's almost inspiring,
Yeah.
is the scary thing, is, like, when Paimon, uh I assume are you talking about, like, almost at the very ending,
Yeah,
that
the
score there?
very, very ending, yeah.
Yeah,
Literally what
and
it ends on.
I that's my favorite part of the score too, because, it's, um it's inspiring, but it's scary, um it's almost like the movie switches for a second, and all of a sudden, like, the protagonist was, like, the demon all along,
Mhm. Yeah.
um, and it's like the film is acting as if you're rooting for the demon,
Uh-huh.
at the end of the movie, and everyone is, like, going like, "Hail Paimon,"
Yeah,
or yeah,
and how it
sorry.
pulls out of the, like, treehouse as if you're, like, one of the nigga boys, like,
Yeah,
bowing
like,
and
it ends, like it ends on a sour note, but it's treating it like it's ending on an inspiring and hopeful message. And I thought that was incredibly interesting. And it made me just sit down the first time I watched the movie just to think about what the filmmaker was trying to do at that beginning or at the end of the movie. Um, and it just made me think about like morality and what it means to be inspired and what the difference between good and bad is,
Mhm.
even though it's like this almost like a very objectively like it's a demon. It's like the scariest
Yes.
shit you'd ever see.
It's
But
not like some empathetic villain, maybe some,
no,
like
yeah,
yeah,
it's
it's
just
like
a
an
demon,
actual like yeah.
literally spirit of the underworld meant to do evil. But
But then you're just like, "Ah," triumph a little bit at
yeah,
the end, and I'm just like, "Yo, what?"
yeah, it's like triumph, and you're just like kind of like scared, um, because you don't know what this triumph means, and you're just like scared of the unknown. Like I always had an unsettled feeling in my stomach whenever I'd see the ending of that movie,
Mhm,
and I felt like the score was really the best part of that.
mhm. But yeah, generally, this is the time where we talk about, like, um, any issues we had, but honestly, I there it's hard
Ish.
to say that, like, a film has no issues, but, also you have this, like, emotional, reaction to this film, like, I cannot, think of anything that didn't work for me, everything just came together so well.
Mm.
So I'm assuming you feel the same way if you have some issues with the film you wanna talk about
Well, I'm
at all?
trying to think about issues I'd have with the film. Um,
I try to wanna give that especially for, other films, I guess, that isn't Hereditary, I try to give, kind of a little bit of both sides, to it, but honestly, I cannot
I
the
mean,
the subjectivity of, like, my enjoyment of this film, I cannot, give anything, in terms
there,
of
yeah, there's a couple things that I could understand if people had a problem with because like it is a slow movie. Um, like the pacing is very slow. And for me, it wasn't really a problem because I got on board with it, but I could understand if someone um got like bored or something throughout the movie. Or if like they were like the film is pretentious because the film is kind of it's pretty pretentious. Um, I kind of eat that pretension up, but I can understand if someone's like, um, if someone thought, well, this film kind of focuses a little too much on I don't know, it kind of overdoes some things or something. I don't know. I'm just trying to be balanced. I'm having a hard time.
Honestly can't. In
I
terms of, like, the
I don't know.
pacing, yeah. I feel like generally horror movies follow that kind of, "Oh, let's set up this nice family, you like them, and then we'll just go to this really high, in, like, the climax, it's, like, horror and scary and stuff, and then you kinda, like, let off again." And I feel like in terms of pacing, I see how people are like, "Okay, well, it's slow." But honestly, that kind of structure, I wouldn't even say that this film is slow. I just feel like it's more of a, instead of this like peak in this climax, and you have like this like, introduction, expository, learning about the family, then it gets a little bit like tenser, and then it goes to its peak, and then it like falls off again, as the movie ends. I feel like instead this film chooses to like almost plateau the whole time. And it's not like a really low plateau where it's not tense the whole time. It's extremely tense the whole time. It just doesn't have that like moment of like extreme climax almost, you know? And in that sense, I feel like there are a lot of films that try to be tense the whole time, and it fails in that aspect. And so it that is when the pacing is kind of um um lacking. Honestly, that's some of my issues with Midsummer, but we'll talk about that
Yeah.
later.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah,
that
we'll
when
probably do that one in another podcast.
but the fact that it tries to be tense the whole time and succeeds in that, I feel like that's almost the opposite of like a slow burn. I feel like it's hits the ground running, and maybe like the running isn't like this kind of 100-meter Usain Bolt thing. It's like more of a mile of just
Yeah.
insanely Olympic running, and it's just super, not like extreme, but consistent. Um and that's what I would say to people who are like pacing. But I don't know. We can do two things here. Uh, we can talk about more of the horror aspect of it in the very like last like 10 minutes or so, because I think
Mhm.
we generally talked more about like the family aspect and some of the earlier horror stuff, but not when it goes like off the rails at the end. We haven't really gotten to talk about that. Either that, or I can do a little bit of reading some of people's negative reviews, and we can discuss like that. Because
I
honestly, for these kinds of films like that I really love like this, I'm not exactly like you, Joey, where it's like I can understand. Like, no, I can understand like why you would think, like for example, the pacing thing, but um I would defend my end and say like I can understand how you can see it as like a pacing issue, but if you look at it from this perspective, it's actually not a pacing issue. It's just that we have this expectation of this climax where it never reached, and so in terms of tenseness, it was consistent, but it just never had that. Like I would explain
Yeah.
um
I
in a
I
more
I think it would be cool actually if you brought up some negative reviews of the movie, because clearly we're having a hard time thinking of anything. So maybe some IMDb reviews can
Okay,
give us
well,
something.
I was reading some, and one of them talks about the ending. And I guess this kind of hits with your I can see how people would think this is pretentious and stuff like that. That's still a little bit about what they're saying. They said they liked the movie until the last 10 minutes. Um but you get this twist, and it starts to get hokey and lame. The spookiness up until that point had now turned into what felt like a last effort for an end to the movie.
I
So
um That's kind of funny because now we can bring up the bad reviews and talk about the last 10 minutes of the
true.
movie. um I can actually understand how they would say that, because I think the majority of the film really it's a very like I don't want to say subtle, but it's not in your face
Mhm.
um for a lot of the movie until the end. um starts to get a lot more traditional horror just at the very end for the climax. Um, so I could see like how they would think there's a change of tone, but I didn't really mind that at all because I felt like it kind of gave a burst of adrenaline to the movie, and I didn't feel like it was too separate from the story. Like I felt like it was a natural conclusion to what they were setting up with taking the Peter's body for Charlie. is going to require some conflict between the characters. So obviously he's going to be running away. And I felt like the scares and the imagery in that movie were not so in your face, and I didn't feel like the tone really shifted at all in the ending. I felt
Mhm.
like the way that they did jump scares when they did them um, were consistent with the way that the rest of the film was going. So I could see like narratively it was a change from the rest of the movie, but I felt like it was earned and it deserved um, the climax that it had.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I definitely agree, and I'm gonna keep talking about expectations. Honestly, I'm pretty sure I'm gonna talk about expectations for like any critics for any film that I love, or just in general. I don't know. Expectation has such a powerful influence on me and understanding films. But yeah, that's kind of I can agree, or I can see that point of view where it's like, oh well, it kind of just doesn't know where to end now because well, made everything so like everything so evil and everything so fit together. Like, it's almost as if that person wanted a good ending, you know? And
Uh-huh.
so since everything bad just fits so nicely together, they're like, "Oh, well, the writer just wrote himself into a corner. Now, like, there's no way that the good can prevail because, like, the cult is just so organized. How is this family gonna fight him?" And so they just ended it with the cult winning, and, like, that's not really how it's supposed to go, but, that dangerously saying, like, "supposed to go."
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
um
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that's kind of what he was saying in his review.
Mhm.
Actually, could you read the review again just to make sure I understand?
Um, well, I just read like 3 sentences. It said, "Well, they liked the movie up until the last 10 minutes. The movie is a little over 2 hours, so that's a long emotional investment, but then you
Mhm.
get to the twist and it starts to get hokey and lame. The spookiness up until that point had now turned into what felt like a last ditch effort for an end to the movie."
Yeah, um I don't know if he was really talking about like for me personally, I didn't feel like he was talking about like expectations for the movie, but more like what what the way that the writing was going. I didn't feel like the way that it was going was a last ditch effort. I felt like they did a good job of narratively planting the seeds for the ending during the entire movie, but um it was more uh bombastic than the rest of the movie was. I feel like in the tone. Um and I feel like that's what he was um saying, like from a tonal point of view, it was just a little bit different than the rest of the movie. That's kind of what I got out of it.
Okay, yeah, yeah, yeah. I don't specifically think he, like, expected a happy ending. That was more like a general, like, statement. But yeah, reading it again, I feel there's this kind of, he says it gets, like, hokey and lame. The spookiness until that point has turned into what felt like a last-ditch effort.
Yeah, I don't know about hokey though. That hokey just like that doesn't make sense to me. I
Honestly, I don't know what that means. What is that word?
I like hokey, like I didn't feel like it was cheesy at all or like it wasn't like it where it was pretty serious the whole movie and it was like I mean, it was funny. Okay, I will get there's one negative I have and that is when when Tony Collette gets you know what's the word? She gets
Possessed?
yeah, possessed, that's the word, sorry. When she gets possessed and then she starts, like, floating, there's this one scene where she's, like, swimming in air, like, behind him, and I thought that was goofy. That was really goofy.
That one
That that
scene.
that did make me laugh. I actually, like, have a chuckle every time I see that because it looks like she's just, like, swimming in midair, but it's, like, someone who doesn't know how to swim at all, like, flying by, and it's like, "Woo!" And I thought that was funny, and probably maybe that's what he was talking about, actually. But other than that, I have no problems.
Yeah, well, I think my point of view now is his issue with the ending is more that it is kind of mm, I want to say non-satisfying.
Mhm.
In response to that, I feel like uh satisfying is kind of different. There's different ways to satisfy, you know. To say it's not satisfying is I think a little bit wrong. It is satisfying. The ending is satisfying. It satisfies in a different way, or it satisfies different people, or it just concludes in a different way. Like to say there's no conclusion to the film is different from saying that there is a conclusion that you didn't didn't resound with you, or I don't remember how that works. But
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
No, I know what you mean, yeah.
yeah. So I think that's a little bit about what he's saying. In terms of the
Yeah.
cheesy part, I have no idea. Like, I don't think anything was cheesy. I didn't even think that floating part was cheesy. But you know, um, I don't know. Creepy
Yeah.
swimming. You know.
Creepy swimming. I mean, there's nothing scarier than, synchronized swimming, and really gave me PTSD for getting in the water.
Yes.
But
But
yeah.
yeah, in terms of the horror aspect, I love the sounds, and this is like a little bit of sound editing that like whenever not Charlie, when Peter is like laying in bed and then Tony is screaming in the background, that was the highest moment of horror for me was when um Peter's in the attic and he just hears this like squelching noise. And honestly, to me, I don't know. I've heard other people be like, "Oh, okay, they know exactly." But I was like, "What? This wire going through this woman's head, this throat? Like how do you know what that sounds like?" When I first heard it, I was like, "What the fuck is that sound?" It sounds so gross, but at the same time, I cannot put my finger on what it is. And then he turns around and I'm like, I should have expected that, but at the same time, what the fuck?
Yeah, no, I didn't see that coming at all. I feel blessed because there's a lot of times where I just don't see things coming in
Mhm,
movies, like when certain sounds happen or anything. Like that, what you were talking about, like, I had no idea that that was gonna happen, even though I should have maybe had a concept of it, but it was really exciting to see.
mhm. Yeah, I feel like that's a bit about getting engrossed in a film. If you get engrossed in a film, like even if things are a little bit obvious, you're kind of just so into the main character, like Peter, you're just so into him. Like he doesn't know what that sound is, so he has to turn around, obviously. So like even if like in the back of your head you're like, I kind of know what sound that is, you're just so put into the shoes of this character that you yourself like mentally turn around and ask like, what is that sound, you know?
Mhm.
And that's why I
Yeah,
found
for sure.
and that's why I found the ending really satisfying to me. Because I'm always watching horror movies, and I'm like, you know what I do in this situation? I fucking kill myself. That's what I do. Like, why would I run around with this monster chasing me or these demons trying to possess me? I just be like, all right, bye world. I ain't suffering to this shit again. And literally, he turns around, he sees his mom freaking sawing her head off with this wire,
Oh,
and he just jumps out the motherfucking window. I'm like,
yeah.
yes, I am satisfied with that conclusion.
Yeah, that is satisfying. That's probably about what I would do in that scenario.
Yeah.
I'd be like, "This is stupid. I'm not doing this anymore.
Yeah.
I am tired of this." Um, how how long have we been going?
A very long time.
Yeah.
I wanna say, like, an hour and 40 minutes at least.
Yeah, I feel like we should try probably cut the podcast here just for
Yeah,
the sake of
definitely.
people listening.
I thought
We
it
talk about this for 10 hours, but
Yeah, I thought it would be difficult, so I was like, "Okay, let's do 2 movies. Let's do one where it's like, alright, something we kinda like and, like, we can pick apart and then one where we really love so that we can, like, go all out and, like, just, like, drool
yeah,
all over." But
yeah.
honestly, one movie, we can talk about that for an hour, not gonna
I
lie.
I think we could talk about one movie. I think next time we should probably go for just one at a time and just really delve in deep. But, yeah, it was
Alright.
a fun podcast to
Yes.
shoot.
Thank you. thank you
Um,
everyone for joining, even though this is probably nobody's gonna join, but maybe
yeah,
Sam. So hi,
yeah,
Sam.
yeah.
I hope you're
Sam,
listening.
Sam, maybe Tommy for the first 20
Yes.
minutes.
This is the Not Double J podcast,
Yeah.
and we'll see you guys later.
All
Bye.
right. Bye.